Okay, so I think we're getting it set up now. And I'm going to start with a preliminary comment. Obviously, I'm going to speak yet again this week about Trump, and now that his incoming cabinet and sub-cabinet officials are almost all named. Obviously, they have to be confirmed. That's a whole other process that won't begin until late January. But that we have a much clearer understanding of what his administration, what he hopes his administration will look like. And I think we can infer from that a fair bit about his plans for his second term in office. And frankly, I am, as you might guess, deeply worried about what we're seeing in the outlines of his new administration, about his likely policy agenda, about his likely approach to his second term in office, and that it appears to be that it's likely to be an autocratic and an exclusionary populist agenda that he will pursue, that it's not just going to be about the economic populism, as we spoke about last week, increase people's wages, decrease prices. If he actually accomplished that, if Donald Trump were to be laser focused on his economic agenda, and if he were actually to succeed in raising wages for workers who have been mainly left out of wealth creation in the American economy for the last 40 years, who've seen their wages stagnate. If he did that while containing inflation, maybe even lowering prices, I think we'd have to say that Donald Trump in his second term in office maybe was in fact accomplishing a fair bit of what he was elected to do, and that we might need to celebrate that. But I am seeing not only that the policies that Donald Trump offers to accomplish his economic populist goals, the policies of mass deportations of immigrants without authorization to be here, the uh, erecting of new tariff barriers. And you may have seen just yesterday, Europe began talking about a Europe first agenda to counter Trump's America first agenda. The likelihood that trade wars are coming if Trump actually acts on the basis of his campaign promise to erect much broader tariffs on goods, not only from China, but from all many other of America's trading partners, that we're likely headed to a trade war, and that may have very strong recessionary impact if we also cut a whole bunch of jobs from the federal government and a bunch of people who were making pretty good civil service salaries become unemployed. This is all not going to raise wages or lower prices. The opposite may happen, which is that we'll be in a recession with inflation, stagflation, as it's sometimes called, and that's a very difficult economic circumstance to be in. And so I worry that he's not going to be able to accomplish his economic populism because he has articulated it in terms of a policy agenda that is likely to be counterproductive. But I also think, and this is the more worrisome thing, that we see that the real emphasis in the appointees, at least in the critical so-called power agencies of government, um, are more likely to be interested in the exclusionary. America is for only true Americans, and that's a narrowly defined group of people, and autocratic. We need a much stronger leader. The president of the United States is hampered, constrained, fettered by checks and balances, the rule of law, institutional constraints within the executive branch and the administrative agencies, and we need to do our best to clear those out of the way so that Donald Trump can really put his imprint on the policy of the country, including right going after the enemies of the people, or to speak perhaps a little bit less grandiloquently, his enemies and the people he hopes his supporters will come to identify as their enemies. So I view this again as a kind of alarm bell talk. We need to be ready. We need to be prepared. We need to be focused. We need to be active. We need to begin to plan how to resist. But having said that, I also want to say um, one of the things Donald Trump does to us is to draw all our attention to him. And there are other and better and more urgent things, perhaps, to be talking about in 2024 on the cusp of 2025. And so I do want to indicate that I want to start talking about things other than Trump's victory or the likely implications of a second Trump presidency. There will be time enough to talk about that in the coming years. And so today I want to begin using the fact that I'm talking about Trump to talk about some other more structural issues in American politics about the rigidity and capture of the administrative state and why, in a sense, that leaves it as a ripe partisan target for someone like Trump. And that in the coming weeks, I'm beginning to work on a series of classes on social media and the digital transformation of the American public sphere that's designed to help us to understand how we've become so fractured as a society, how we've become so susceptible to disinformation, but also other things that social media do to us, not just politically, but in a much broader public health frame. The Surgeon General has written a whole report about social media and youth, tying increased use of social media to various health, both psychological and physical issues. And I believe that we don't need to confine ourselves to speaking of young people. They are perhaps most susceptible to the influence of social media, and growing up in its presence, those of us who are not digital natives have maybe formed our personalities prior to encountering this technology, and so maybe a little bit less susceptible to some of its deleterious impacts. But having said all of that, I do want you to know I'm planning to talk about things other than Trump, even as we spend a lot of time talking about Trump. So the question here: are we seeing, and in what ways can we detect the fact that Donald Trump does intend to use Project 2025 as the playbook for his second administration, his second go round as the President of the United States, that project calls for substantial autocratic expansion of executive power and the use of that power to privilege certain groups, subpopulations within our country, and to target and disadvantage other groups. Is that where Trump is going? And if so, will the Republican Party follow him? Will the Supreme Court check his ability to do this? Will the federal government be remade in the United States, as it has been in other parts of the world, to be an instrument of an autocrat's power? And I don't think that it's clear cut what the answer to those questions are, but I do think that they are becoming increasingly urgent questions to ask and to do our homework, to be ready to be able to answer these questions and to act accordingly. So, um, I'll be very quick about this, but I do think this is extremely important as the background to this discussion. We are getting more information about how Trump won and how wide the margin of victory is for Donald Trump and the Republicans. And as we know, they now have complete control over the presidency, the Senate, the House, and a supermajority of Republican appointed justices on the Supreme Court, a kind of complete control of the federal government that means there's a potential for one party domination. And of course, the leader of this party is Donald Trump, and Donald Trump works vigorously to put his stamp on his party, and in particular to demand loyalty, obedience, subservience from the people within the party, and to punish those who thwart him or who resist his will. But having said all of that, I think the narrowness of the victory is something that others within the party are going to be paying attention to. And so we now know a little bit more that Donald Trump, it appears, is probably not going to get quite up to 50% of the popular vote. That although he's getting, in the mid 70 million votes, that Kamala Harris appears to have gotten within maybe a couple million votes of Donald Trump, and that'll amount to maybe a 1.5% victory in the popular vote. And in particular, that had around 250,000 voters swung in the other direction in the swing states, Harris probably would have won this election, right? And it's not just that, right? So if we look, remember this diagram, the dark red states are the states that were swing states, were up for grabs. Joe Biden had won most of them, and then Donald Trump won all of them. Look at how they voted in the Senate races in those states in which there were Senate races in 2024. Not all of them had Senate races, but in those in which there were, actually there was an awful lot of ticket splitting, and the Democratic Senate candidates won in Arizona, in Nevada, in Michigan, in Wisconsin, obviously not in Pennsylvania. That has been recently decided. But all of that to say, it does appear that this was not the kind of mandate that said, we not only want Donald Trump, but we want to empower Congress to do Donald Trump's biddings. As opposed to that, this is a kind of hedging vote. Well, we may not have sufficient confidence in Kamala Harris to choose her, but we may also not have a ton of confidence in Donald Trump. Let's put a Democrat in the Senate in order to maybe serve as something as a check. And I think a lot of Republicans are going to be doing not only the electoral math that I'm trying to, make clear for you, but also probably thinking in the terms that I'm thinking about the Trump economic agenda. Practically every economist in the United States says if you have substantial new tariffs, you're going to have increases in prices. It's going to be inflationary. And we've talked about the figure, maybe $2,500 to $4,000 per person in the country when the tariffs, if the tariffs as described by Trump on the campaign trail become policy, things are going to get much more expensive. And by the way, it's going to prompt a trade war, and that's going to probably lead to layoffs in the United States because other countries are going to be buying less of our goods because they've become more expensive due to reciprocal tariffs. And by the way, those mass deportations, I think they're going to be people in the particular states that the senators and the members of Congress represent saying to them, you're going to gut our labor force. Don't do that, please. And if Trump goes ahead and acts on it, and in a sense, I think he's kind of bound by his campaign and the pledges he's made and his reputation as a ruthless administrator to do at least some high profile deportations. If those deportations really do start to go into the millions, it's going to cause labor shortages, and that's going to cause productivity problems in various sectors and potentially increases in prices as well. And so the senators who have to confirm his administration and actually pass the policies that require legislative support, well, it's a very narrow victory in an institution that has a filibuster rule, that has the likes of Lisa Murkowski or Rand Paul, two very different politicians, but both of whom seem, for different reasons, to not like aspects of the Trump policy. It could be very quickly that Donald Trump will run into some resistance within his own party, in light of the ambiguity of his mandate and the slenderness of his victory. I won't go too much into this, but I do think one of the questions we're asking is right, how much is this a realignment election as opposed to just a narrow pendulum swing election? And if it's a realignment election, what kind? Is the Republican Party really beginning to reorient working class workers out of the Democratic Party and into the Republican Party? And if so, does that give Donald Trump a stable, lasting majority coalition for his MAGA agenda? Or alternatively, did they swing because they liked Trump more than Harris, but they're still very much swing voters in play, and they could go back to the Democrats pretty quickly, especially if Trump's economic populism turns out to be a recipe for disaster as opposed to delivering on the promises. And similarly, and this is to come to the core of the issue, has the Republican Party really become a right-wing autocratic populist party? And obviously Donald Trump is trying very hard to move the party in this direction. I will point out, I think one of the big developments of the last week is that Elon Musk announced that he is funding a new super PAC, put $100 million into it, which for him is, a tiny, tiny little fraction of the additional valuation of his wealth that results from the Trump victory, just the money he's made in the last couple of weeks as Tesla and other stocks have increased. But having said that, the purpose of the PAC, right, and $100 million is very little money for Trump. I'm sorry, very little money for Musk, a rounding error, if you will, but it's a lot of money in the world of politics. It's there to support primary challengers to Republicans who don't do Trump's will in Congress. And so I do think we're beginning to see a little bit more already, right? This is still 2024. Joe Biden is still president, but of the kind of oligarchic or plutocratic politics that you see in many regimes that have moved in the autocratic direction. So let me unpack that for a second. The very rich people in the society hope to benefit from the way in which autocrats run the government, the kind of policies they pass. We'll get into this with the attack on the administrative state pretty soon. The autocrats, on the other hand, hope to benefit from the oligarchs investing their money in order to promote their party, their causes, maybe to enrich them personally, but also to go after their political opponents. And this is very typical of Vladimir Putin's Russia, of the party in power in Hungary, Erdogan's Turkey, right? And so we see this in other places in the world when strongmen rise. And the question is this starting to happen in the United States? And might this give Trump a little bit more leverage and power beyond his slender and ambiguous political mandate? So how much will the Republicans in Congress fall in line with Trump? Big question. Don't know the answer. Something just to be attuned to, and we will get our preliminary information pretty quickly. I think, in a sense, we're already beginning to see it with Matt Gaetz withdrawing from the nomination to be the next Attorney General of the United States because he says he was making the rounds in the Senate, and the Republicans in the Senate said to him, "We won't support you, or we can't guarantee that we'll support you," and so we have a new candidate to be the Attorney General. And then final question, right? What other sources of constraint will there be? If I'm right, and I believe the numbers make this clear, the voting patterns make this clear, that this is a weak mandate at best. Will there be the capacity in the courts, the willingness in the courts, the commitment to the rule of the law to resist autocracy? Will the media stand up, right? I think there's some signs already, for instance, with the Washington Post under Jeff Bezos's ownership, that Bezos stands to lose too much if Trump decides to be vindictive with him. And so the Washington Post didn't run an endorsement in this presidential election. Bezos congratulated Trump. There's a little bit of back and forth on Twitter between Bezos and Musk. And so, right, another question: how independent and critical will the media be? The states, civil society organizations. This will help to determine whether or not and how quickly what I'm going to call the radical MAGA Project 2025 agenda might be implemented by the incoming Trump administration. So I believe that Trump and his allies will interpret the mandate in this election as being about this more radical agenda, not just economic populism, but exclusionary and autocratic populism, not just increasing wages, lowering costs, but reclaiming America for true Americans, where that is cashed out in terms of people who are native born, legal citizens, people who are white, people who are straight, people who are married with children. We know that J.D. Vance considers this to be extremely important to so-called Christian nationalism. And of course, Trump appointed him to be his vice president. And then also for right the friends of this incoming administration. Those are the true Americans. The people who criticize them, of course, the immigrants, and especially the undocumented immigrants, those are the enemies of the people. And in order to be able to reimpose traditional values, to be able to assert the normal privilege of hitherto dominant identities, to be able to expel millions of people from the country, and to be able to uh, run the federal government from a position of power where there is a clear singular leader who is capable of doing what he needs to do to meet the dangers of an increasingly dangerous and complex world. We need to break down the constraints and fetters of the rule of law, checks and balances, the procedures of the civil code that limit the president's capacity to fire civil servants. This, I think, is how Trump is going to interpret his agenda. At least that seems to be what a lot of his important appointments reveal. And so let me talk about for a few minutes why I think this may be the direction that Donald Trump is going. The first is Donald Trump's own interpretation of leadership, right, of power, and that Donald Trump is motivated by the idea that he needs maximal power, that the person with maximal power prevails, but not only prevails, is respected, that in this sense, power begets more power because being seen as powerful leads others to defer or submit to you. And he views the leaders he admires most as people who, because of their will to power, have maximized their personal power, their institutional power, and he too wants to be in this position. He thinks it's integral to his success and the success of his movement. And so he has an expansionary interpretation of executive power, right? The theory here is the theory of the unitary executive, that everybody who works in the executive branch works for the president. That includes the people who populate the administrative agencies, who are by statute civil servants. Joe Biden leaves, Donald Trump moves in. None of those people are supposed to change either in terms of the jobs they hold or the jobs they do. They are supposed to be, if you will, politically neutral, chosen for merit and competence, and therefore independent from the president. That clearly limits the power that Donald Trump has. He would like to be able to really put his stamp on all of those independent agencies, and therefore he plans to try to reschedule, right, to change the legal status of the civil service, to reclassify a whole bunch of employees as Schedule F employees who are political appointees and not career civil servants. That would greatly enhance his ability to control these agencies. The second reason, it's not just the power calculus of Donald Trump, it is also, I think, what Donald Trump thinks his most loyal supporters want him to do. And so I'll just point out, if you were a low information voter, if you were just letting the news find you, if you saw a few ads for Donald Trump, the exit polling and focus groups seem to indicate that it was the economic populism that led many of those voters to come to Trump, or to put it differently, the mistrust of Kamala Harris in her ability to manage inflation and increase wages and economic growth. But if you are the kind of person who goes to a Trump rally, if you're the kind of person who gives money to Donald Trump, if you're the kind of person who is going to be part of the loyal base that Donald Trump is going to need in order to maintain his popularity and standing, very often those people actually support him for the MAGA agenda, for what I'm calling the exclusionary and autocratic populism, not just for the economic populism. They want him to be more powerful and to use that power ruthlessly to go after his enemies, to reimpose tradition on American society to benefit people like them. And so I think Trump sees a political calculus that suggests he needs to act in this way to continue to maintain the support from his most loyal supporters. And by the way, Trump both demands and rewards loyalty. Third, right, there are other powerful allies who want to dismantle the administrative state and its regulatory regime, and the MAGA Project 2025 agenda serves their ends. And so the textbook case here would be Elon Musk, who does billions of dollars with the federal government, who is therefore regulated quite extensively, is in some disputes right now with the Environmental Protection Agency. As I indicated, right, the stock valuation of Tesla went up almost $50 billion in the few days after Donald Trump was elected. And part of the reason that people believe that the valuation went up is because the word on the street was that Donald Trump would get the Federal Transportation Administration out of the way of authorizing the self-driving technology that Musk thinks will really give Tesla dominance in the American automobile industry. That's just one example, right, of many industries. You can think here of the oil or petroleum industry as another industry. You can think here of banking, investing, but also cryptocurrency. And please note, these industries are in tension with each other. An electric vehicle mogul and the petroleum industry, crypto and traditional banking, those are not natural allies, but they do seem to have a shared interest in being less regulated. And if Donald Trump succeeds in dismantling aspects of the administrative state, it will dramatically diminish both the regulatory power and the capacity, the competence of the regulatory state to update, to enforce, to administer regulations. Um, Fourth reason to think that it's likely that Trump is going to go in this direction is that pursuing the autocratic agenda fits the narrative that seems the safest political bet for Trump, especially if there's some likelihood that his economic agenda, let's be optimistic, is going to produce short-term pain, even if it produces long-term gains. Well, describing himself as engaged in a battle to wrest control from the deep state. And please note, right, that's the way Trump and his allies in the MAGA and Project 2025 movement describe the administrative state, and to reclaim power over it in order to be able to claim power for real Americans and to do so in a way that will eventually give Trump the power to benefit them in more materially measurable ways. Will their wages go up? Will their ability to buy a house, to save, go up? To be able to say, look, I've tried, we've got the tariffs in place, we've done the deportations, but the deep state is still thwarting me, it's still hindering me, and that's where I need to concentrate my efforts, right? And that gives him both a built-in excuse for perhaps the failures of the economic policy and, in a sense, a really clear call to arms for his supporters. I'm doing your work. It's a battle, and I need your support. Um, by the way, autocratic control over what in Eastern Europe are called the power agencies. And here, right, we're talking about the Department of Justice, or the department that includes the FBI and the prosecutors and the people who can, right, do audits and issue search warrants and tap phones. And of course, the Department of Defense and the civilian control over the military, and then also the national security agencies, again, tremendous surveillance capacities, as well as just a great deal of intelligence, as well as some capacity to do violence. This generates greater power and other potentials for using that power. If Donald Trump means it, he wants retribution against his perceived enemies, the people who, right, prosecuted him or tried to prosecute him for these trumped up charges. He wants to go after Jack Smith or Merrick Garland or Joe Biden, and to make them feel the pain he's felt for the last few years controlling the Department of Justice, not by just appointing an independent attorney general who's bound by the rule of law and their constitutional oath, but who really is a lackey, who really is just going to do Trump's will. That's what he needs if he wants to use the military to do deportations. And if there are both legal, maybe even constitutional, but also institutional constraints on doing that, the military does not want to be seen as the plaything of one president or one political party. He needs somebody really loyal at the Department of Defense, somebody maybe who was a Fox and Friends news host, but doesn't have any other real qualifications, and so completely owes their elevation to Donald Trump, will be completely loyal to Donald Trump. The idea that if he is able to use these agencies to target scapegoats, to really go after, right, the immigrants, to really go after political rivals within the Republican Party, within the Democratic Party, people in the press, people in the universities who he sees as enemies of the people, he is going to be able to, in a sense, redirect anxiety into anger, that populist alchemy I've talked with you about before, and really be able to give people another outlet for their political discontent, something to focus on other than perhaps the checkered success of the economic programs. He may even be able to allow the groups who support him in part on the basis of their grievance. My status, my standing, my respect, my privilege in this society has been eroded, to begin to make them feel a little bit more power, a little bit more swagger, a little bit more impunity, because these powerful agencies seem to be on the side, I'm sorry, of people like them. So now, um, just refreshing your memory, what Project 2025 actually says, right? Crack down on illegal immigrants, right? Carry out mass deportations, increase ICE agents, build camps to detain immigrants, push other countries to take would-be asylum seekers from the United States. By the way, part of the reason to threaten Mexico with tariffs is to force them to do our bidding, to have another Muslim ban, to try to end birthright citizenship, right? The right constitutional amendments from the post-Civil War era that says anybody who's native born is automatically a citizen, use military force on American soil. But in order to do all of this, Project 2025 also calls very clearly for a vast expansion of the authority of the president over the executive branch and the administrative state, treating Viktor Orban from Hungary as the model here, right? So reduce the size and power of the administrative state so that it's completely controlled by the president, and the president then gets to be freed from the constraints of the judiciary, the law, the press, to act in a more unilateral way. And here I'll just say very quickly that part of what differentiates Trump 2025 from Trump 2017 is he's not bringing with him an administration, a cabinet designed to, if you will, calm the fears of people within his party, people within the broader society, people within the markets, that he's going to be radical or amateurish, as he did in 2017. He brought in a bunch of mainstream Republicans who came to be called the adults in the room, and slowly but surely he recognized that they were trying to steer him, to limit him, to manipulate him, to get him to work through the normal channels of power and to defer in certain respects to the experts. In 2025, Trump will be coming in with a handpicked group of people at the cabinet level, at the sub-cabinet level, who have been working for years to figure out how to maximize his power over the administrative state. This is part and parcel of this agenda. And again, what we see in the actual people who Trump is appointing. And I want to be clear, it's not every one of them. I've circled in yellow the people who are clearly already aligned with the MAGA movement. And I also want to emphasize at least some of them, right? Pam Bondi for the Attorney General, who's replacing Matt Gaetz, right? Matt Gaetz was an even more clear-cut case. Pete Hegseth at Defense, Tulsa Gabbard in the Department of National Intelligence, Linda McMahon as the Education Secretary, Dr. Oz, of course, in Medicare and Medicaid, have very little of the requisite qualifications, right? So they are elevated by Donald Trump. They're going to be deeply indebted to Donald Trump for their power, for their prestige. They're going to therefore be his clear hatchet men and women just doing his will. And then others of them, while they might be better qualified, for instance, Russell Vought at the Office of Management and Budget, he is one of the main authors of Project 2025. Again, I think there's good reason to expect, as is, by the way, right, Stephen Miller, who's going to be Deputy Chief of Staff, Thomas Homan, who has a lot of experience in the administration of deportation, brought in to be efficient at that. Brendan Carr at the FCC, who again authored part of Project 2025 and who is indicated that the president should be able to use executive power to go after his enemies in the press, right? Maybe take away their licenses on television stations, etc. This is a administration where in those power agencies and the things that are the clear priorities of the president, there are people in place who frankly would be too radical or too disqualified, too subservient to serve in another administration. And so this is, I think, part of the evidence that this is the direction this administration is likely to go. So now to move a little bit away from just Trump and the incoming administration to begin to pan out, if you will, I want to talk a little bit about the administrative state, why we have it, what it does, why it lends itself maybe to abuse and capture, whether or not it can be improved. And I'll give you my bottom line, which is I do think that we have a large administrative state. It grew over the course of the 20th century from basically non-existent to perhaps the Supreme Court sometimes calls it the fourth branch of the American government. Much of the federal budget is actually channeled into or through the administrative state, that we have it for good reasons, but that there's been a lot of inertia, that it has not been reformed or improved, despite clear signs that it is atrophying and captured. And so, in a sense, it was ripe for targeting, either targeting for scaling back or elimination, which is kind of the Supreme Court approach, at least as outlined in a number of recent cases like West Virginia v. EPA, or the relentless case, the cases that are basically removing deference, judicial deference from the administrative state and interpreting their statutory authority and mandates. And so I want to spend a little bit of time at the conclusion today talking about the history of the administrative state, as well as its need for reform, the proposals for reform. So I'll start with a quote from Hannah Arendt. I think many of you know that I find her to be one of the most illuminating theorists of totalitarianism, without saying that Donald Trump is a totalitarian. I think that would be a vast exaggeration. Frankly, it aggrandizes him far too much. He's a would-be autocrat, right? And so what Arendt says about Hitler, about Stalin, I think is useful to think through its implications about America in 2025. She says totalitarianism in power invariably replaces all first-rate talents, regardless of their sympathies, with those crackpots and fools whose lack of intelligence and creativity is the best guarantee of their loyalty, right? And I think we see this in the approach, but I think we need to note, by the way, this is in many respects true not just of totalitarians, but also of the United States executive branch government until the late 19th century. So that's right, the history that we started with a spoils system. Essentially, the winner of the presidential election gets to appoint almost everybody in the executive branch, and very often that was just rewarding people who had helped them win the next election by giving them a well-paid job that didn't involve doing much of anything. And certainly it limited the professionalism, the competence, and the independence of the federal executive staff. They were just there in order to make sure that they went out and campaigned next time for their party, their leader. The progressive movement in the last quarter, last third of the 19th century, one of its big calls for reform was to create independence and competence in the administrative staff of executives. And they started at the state level in Wisconsin, for instance, but they eventually set their sights on the federal government. And in 1883, they persuaded Congress to pass the Pendleton Act. It's got a longer title than that, but that's what it's known as for short. And this is an act that says jobs in the federal civil service need to be awarded on the basis of merit and not political affiliation. It should be competence that determines who's in the bureaucracy. By the way, right, when we were passing this legislation, we were looking at what Prussia was doing, what France was doing, what England was doing, and there was a national interest dimension to this. They have more competent administrations. They're doing better at building their militaries, collecting their taxes, keeping their populations safe. They're therefore growing economically. And if we want to compete with them, we need to have a competent civil administration. The third then big episode in the narrative of the growth of the administrative state is really FDR and the New Deal, the response to the Great Depression, the sense that the national economy had grown so large and so complex that it needed national regulation. The failure of regulation led to the Great Depression, but also, right, Upton Sinclair writing about the meat industry and what, large scale capitalism, where you're no longer just dealing with your local merchant in your small town, someone whose reputation depends on them delivering safe, quality goods to you. You're dealing with a national economy where there's not that kind of accountability and therefore rampant room for abuse. So we need a state that does the work of holding our economic actors accountable. By the way, we now had a federal income tax, so we could fund that state. And we were a much more complex society. We had automobiles and electricity, again, more risks, and so we had to regulate more. And so in an effort to better regulate economic power relations, the safety of the products we delivered, Congress began delegating via statute to what we now call the three-letter agencies, right? The FDA, the EPA, the FCC. OSHA is four letters, right? Which is why we compress it. Began saying to those agencies, right? We want you to protect our highway safety. We want you to protect our food and our drugs. We want you to protect our consumer products. We want you to protect our air and our water so we can breathe it and drink it and not be at risk. And we're going to mandate that you do that, that you propagate regulations, that you update those regulations as circumstances change, and give you the authority to actually devise the details of those regulations. We'll tell you the big ends we want you to accomplish, and then you work out the minutia, because frankly, we in Congress don't have the expertise to do this well, and we recognize in a complex, fast-moving society and economy, things are going to change more quickly, and that Congress is not very good at legislating every time something changes. So let's give this to the administrative state to handle. These agencies grew, especially in the middle of the 20th century, but also all the way through Richard Nixon. Please note, it's right Nixon who creates the Environmental Protection Agency, or who at least signs it into law. And so long movement of the growth of the administrative state, in which it's kind of an amalgam of executive and legislative power. It's located in the executive branch, but it's authorized and funded and also given its statutory mandates by the legislative branch. And one more big moment in the development, which is that there were post-Watergate reforms, because, right, there was a growing concern. Herbert Hoover, the FBI, under the Department of Justice, was already someone who was aggrandizing and abusing his power, but then especially with the revelations of Watergate, the idea that we've got, not just the FBI, but the CIA, the Department of Justice, the Department of Defense, and they're all controlled by one person. And if that person is not ethical, if that person is corrupt, they could abuse all that power. Let's create constraints, and some of this is legislative, some of this is norms promulgated internal to the administrative agencies like the Department of Justice, working hard to secure its perceived independence from the president, so that the vast powers concentrated in the administrative state are used for the purposes for which they were created in their legislative authorization, and not simply the playthings of the president. The idea that a conservative Supreme Court majority already seems skeptical of this, what I've called before, grafting of a modern administrative state onto an 18th century constitutional structure, speaks to I think, growing sense that a large portion of the conservative movement in the United States sees this as overgrown and as a transfer of power that is hostile to them and to the interests they represent. I think this goes back in many ways to the old dominant pro-business wing in the Republican Party, to things we've talked about before, like the Powell Memorandum, which gives rise to the modern conservative legal movement. The idea that in order for entrepreneurship and economic growth to take hold, there needs to be less of a regulatory burden. And so we need to scale back the administrative state. Long predates the rise of Donald Trump. But I want to suggest that the growing partisan polarization, not in terms of the oligarchs or the corporations or the political elite, but now as a large scale popular political movement, is of a more recent vintage. And in particular, the idea that the administrative state and its agencies are subject to a kind of partisan polarization. You can see this happened relatively recently with the Department of Justice, in which, right, its favorability rating among all Americans has gone down, but this is especially true for Republicans, less true for Democrats. I'm sure, right, it's obvious that this has a lot to do with the fact, of course, that the Department of Justice was prosecuting Donald Trump. But it's not an isolated phenomenon. If you look here, right, the favorability or unfavorability of, right, and then we start going through the Center for Disease Controls, the EPA, the Department of Education, Health and Human Services, FBI, Department of Transportation. They are all viewed much more negatively by Republicans than by Democrats. And that's a peculiar kind of polarization, it seems to me, one that requires a little bit more explanation. And so I'm going to suggest that COVID mandates are one really good illustration of the polarizing, partisan split in attitudes about the administrative state. It is, of course, right, the CDC that was telling people first that you need to socially distance, that you need to mask, that you need to stay home from work if you work in a high density environment, that eventually you need to take vaccines if you want to go back to work or into restaurants or into movie theaters. And there was a sense on the part of a large portion of conservative Republicans, especially younger men, that this was just the overweening nanny state getting at it again, doing too much, trying to restrict my liberty. And it comes in a broader climate, right, in which there is a sense that whether it's environmental regulation telling me what kind of car I can drive, or increasing the price of my gas, or it is vaccination telling me what I've got to put in my children's bodies, or it is, right, constraints on what I can say. Do I have to say LGBTQ? Why can't I say gay or even some derogatory term? Do I have to say African American? Why can't I keep saying black, right? That there is this kind of sense that the establishment, the agencies that represent this establishment, have been taken over by liberal elites. There's a liberalization of the bureaucracies, and at the same time, a kind of institutionalization of liberalism. Liberals have become, right, good at funding the nonprofits, the NGOs that often train the people who then go lead the administrative agencies, who create the policies, their think tanks as well, and that this is all aligned with a liberal agenda that is, in a sense, an agenda of constraint on many Americans who are already feeling vulnerable and like they've lost liberty, lost power, lost their economic viability as well. And so the majority of the Supreme Court appears skeptical to this. Corporations, oligarchs, those subject to regulative authority, would like to see portions of this at least dismantled because it's hostile to their narrow interests. I want to point out, right, there's this interesting thing happening where the automobile industry seems to be trying to figure out how to lobby Trump to keep the Biden era clean tailpipe regulations in place because they've already invested so much money in it, and they want to maintain uniformity in the industry so that nobody is disadvantaged, so that the regulations don't swing back and forth every 4 years, creating an unstable environment for their businesses. So there is the narrow interest and the broader interest. I think the broader interest is often in having all the regulations in place except those that keep me from making as much money as I want to. And then please note, right, that Trump comes into this playing field lots of partisan resentment against regulations in the administrative state, a Supreme Court that appears to be chipping away at its power, a lot of people who've given a lot of money to get him elected, in part because they're angry at the Biden administration for instance, going after Google with antitrust, but also for all of these new environmental regulations. They want government to get out of the way of them wrecking the environment or creating a cryptocurrency boom. Trump is, as is often the case, opportunistic, understands, if not the details of the case against the administrative state, at least the broad-based appeal of hostility to it, and therefore he's he's proposing not reform. And this is, I don't think, something I'll be able to talk enough with you about today, but I do think there's a very strong case for reforming the administrative state. He's really talking about taking a jackhammer to it. And so let me conclude and open up questions, but just remind you, when we were talking about how to make the American economy work better for more Americans, one of the things I talked with you about is changing the approach to economic governance and doing so by reforming the administrative state. I really like the work of K. Sabeel Rahman, who was in the Biden administration for a couple years on these issues. He's now at Cornell Law School. He has a very good co-authored book with Holly Russell Gilman, who works in the think tank foundation world, called Civic Power, Rebuilding American Democracy in an Era of Crisis. And I do think the need for administrative state reform is genuine, is real. But I do think if what we end up with is a president who is going to dismantle the administrative state, try to take over and politicize agencies that do work that we want and need them to do, that we will echo the old refrain, right? You know, the administrative state is not great, but we will miss it when it's gone. And that the real shame in all of this is that the Democrats had the opportunity to, over the last 4 years, work on greater administrative uh, state reform. They didn't. And so now the initiative is going to shift to Donald Trump, who won't do reform, but will do something potentially much more destructive, much more politicizing with the administrative state. Let me stop there. I know I've gone over a couple minutes, but I imagine you guys have questions, comments. Who wants to begin? Iris, go ahead. You're still muted. Yeah, try holding the space bar. There you go. You got it.
There's been a lot of chatter among the more progressive elements of our society, and they've given a lot of signals of hopefulness in reforming the way we do things and our ability to push back against this conservative group. Do you think there's much opportunity for the more liberal group to come to some place where they can be effective?
Well, so I think liberals and progressives, those who are advocates of administrative reform in particular, are going to be playing defense for at least the next couple of years, right? That there were out of power, and not only that, but we see an administration coming in that looks poised to try to abuse the power that it has to enact an agenda that is going to be damaging to the institutions of government that definitely need reforming, but not leveling, right? And so let me say, in the first instance, I'm sorry, but I don't think this is the moment. But then add as a more, I think, optimistic way of answering your question, Iris, that I do think if Trump, right, overplays his hand, he's elected by a narrow majority to be an economic populist. He governs as if he won in a landslide and tries to be an autocratic populist. The economic agenda fails. The autocratic agenda never is very popular, and very quickly people begin to turn against him. It could actually, in the long term, strengthen the hand of the people who are saying we need reform. And so I think that that will require, some
Mm.
continued developments that we're not in control of, and it will require gifted leadership, gifted strategy to say, here's the right lesson to draw from this fiasco. We need to move past exclusionary, autocratic populism. It's discredited. That's what you get when you follow this path. And let's instead work not on, treating the symptom of the problem with snake oil, but work on addressing the root of the problem with genuine reform. And so I think there's a chance, and I think there's a growing understanding on the part of progressives. Yes, the administrative state is not working. Yes, the administrative state is captured by the agencies that, I'm sorry, the industries that it's supposed to regulate. Yes, the administrative state in many ways is getting in the way of the provision of important goods that we need, like affordable housing. The regulatory thicket is far too difficult to navigate to get housing built on time. But having said all of that, that requires reform. That requires a constituency for reform. That might just be one of the consequences of disillusionment with Trump if his policies really backfire. So might have to wait a few years, but maybe that.
Just a few.
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you, Iris. Good question. And anybody else today? Well, Ruth, I can't tell. Are you just coming forward? No. Okay. I'm going to say happy Thanksgiving. I hope it's a good holiday for you. And like I started to do today, I want to transition in the weeks that come to talking about some other topics. We don't need to be all Trump all the time. He tends to do that to us, but there are other important and good things to be talking about. I will be out there in January and seeing you in person in the new year. In the meantime, be well, stay warm, stay dry, enjoy the holidays. I look forward to seeing you next Saturday. Bye, guys. Take care.
Bye bye.
Bye bye.